Her hands were trembling as the soldiers lifted her into the carriage. She was only 16. History remembers her as Consort Han, gift from Korea to the Ming Palace. But while the official scrolls describe a life of luxury, they omit the terrifying reality of what happened the moment the palace gates slammed shut. Her mother's last memory wasn't a hug, but a thumbprint in ink on a document that effectively signed her daughter's death warrant. This is the story the emperors spent centuries trying to erase. They called it honor. They called it service to the empire. They wrapped it in silk and ceremony and called it privilege. But strip away the propaganda and you'll see what it really was. The largest organized system of female enslavement in human history, lasting over 2,000 years, consuming over 100,000 lives, and erased so thoroughly from official memory that even today, millions walk through its halls without knowing the screams those walls once held. This is the story they don't want told. The story buried beneath golden roofs and tourist photographs. The story of the women who entered the Forbidden City and never left, not because they didn't want to, but because the empire that took them made sure they never could. The illusion. River die Vitriol Anyan Vermission. The cicada Mandukstone. Line of extreme peeparding timidity Herbini. Survivement. The sea coast arbiter.
The illusion versus the reality.
When most people imagine Chinese imperial concubines, they see something from a period drama. Elegant women in embroidered silk robes, writing poetry in moonlit gardens. Delicate beauty, refined culture. A life of luxury serving the most powerful man in Asia. That image is a lie. Its propaganda so successful that it survived the fall of the empire itself. So effective that modern historical dramas still perpetuate it. So deeply embedded in cultural memory that when you tell people the truth, they resist believing it. But the truth is documented. It exists in palace records, in diplomatic archives, in medical documents written with clinical detachment, in the testimonies of survivors, in archaeological evidence that cannot be disputed. The truth is this: imperial concubines were not wives. They were not companions. They were not even considered fully human under imperial law. They were classified as objects. Precious objects, certainly. Valuable property, but objects nonetheless. Literally equated in legal documents to porcelain vases and jade ornaments. They could be bought, traded, gifted, inherited, and discarded with the same legal framework that governed furniture. This wasn't metaphorical. This wasn't poetic language. This was the actual legal classification that determined every aspect of their existence.
Peace and praise my life for self and this just it's cast to the
The harvest. The system that fed the imperial harems operated like agricultural production, and the language used internally reflected this. Officials didn't recruit women, they harvested them. Every 3 years, imperial representatives traveled through the provinces in what was euphemistically called the Xiunu selection, the selection of elegant maidens. The name itself is propaganda. There was nothing elegant about it. It was systematic, mandatory, and backed by the full force of imperial law. During the Ming Dynasty, no family was exempt. Every unmarried woman between the ages of 13 and 17 had to be presented for inspection. Hiding a daughter was classified as treason against the emperor, punishable by execution of the entire family and confiscation of all property. Think about what this meant in practice. Every 3 years, every family with daughters lived in terror. Wealthy families could sometimes bribe officials to overlook their daughters, claiming illness or hidden defects. But poor families had no such options. Their daughters were examined like livestock. The inspection process was brutal in its thoroughness. Palace eunuchs and imperial physicians examined every candidate. They measured height, weight, bone structure. They examined skin for blemishes, scars, birthmarks. They checked teeth, hair, fingernails. They assessed voice quality, gait, posture. Any imperfection was grounds for disqualification. A small scar from a childhood fall. A birthmark on the shoulder slightly crooked teeth. These things could save a girl's life by making her unsuitable for imperial service. Those who passed the initial inspection faced further rounds: personality assessment, family background investigation, tests of memory, obedience, and temperament. The process could take weeks, with candidates kept in temporary holding facilities, unable to communicate with their families. Families of selected girls received compensation, a small stipend, perhaps a minor official title for the father. But refusing this compensation meant rejecting the emperor's generosity, which was another form of treason. The system was designed so that legal compliance was the only option. And what happened to these families afterward? Most never heard from their daughters again. Letters were forbidden. Visits were impossible. The imperial palace was a black hole from which no information escaped. Occasionally, if a concubine rose to high rank, her family might receive news through official channels. A larger stipend might arrive. But for the vast majority, their daughters simply vanished behind the red walls of the Forbidden City. Some families held funeral ceremonies for daughters who were still alive, not out of pessimism, but out of clear-eyed understanding of reality. The girl who had lived in their home, who had learned to cook their family recipes, who had played in their courtyard, that girl was gone. What existed now was imperial property, bearing a registration number.
Korean tribute.
But the domestic selection system was only one source. The empire had another method for acquiring women, one that revealed even more clearly how the system viewed them: diplomatic tribute. For centuries, neighboring states sent tribute to the Chinese emperor as acknowledgement of his supremacy: gold, silk, horses, and women. Women were listed in tribute inventories alongside material goods because that's what they were considered: gifts to demonstrate submission. Korea sent more than 100 women to the Ming court between 418 and 1435. These weren't volunteers. They weren't diplomatic marriages between noble families. They were quotas demanded by the emperor and filled by Korean officials who had no choice but to comply. The Korean records of these transfers survive, and they're devastating in their detail. They list names, ages, family backgrounds. They record the protests of parents, the tears of mothers, the formal ceremonies where girls were handed over to Chinese officials. These girls traveled for weeks in sealed carriages. They couldn't see outside. They couldn't speak to each other. Guards were authorized to use severe punishment for any disobedience. Korean diplomatic archives record that at least one girl in each tribute group typically died during transport, sometimes from illness into confined, unsanitary conditions, sometimes from punishment for attempting escape, sometimes from despair so profound that they simply stopped eating. The bodies were left wherever they died. There was no ceremony, no return to family. The remaining girls learned the lesson. Resistance was futile. Survival required absolute submission. When these Korean women arrived at the Forbidden City, they faced an additional layer of isolation. They didn't speak the language fluently. They didn't understand the cultural codes. They had no family connections, no allies, no one who shared their background. They were the most vulnerable people in an already brutal system, and everyone knew it, breaking them down. The selected women, whether from China or abroad, didn't go directly to the harem. First, they underwent what palace records called refinement, a term that obscures months or years of systematic psychological destruction. The first phase was identity erasure. They cut the women's hair, which in traditional Chinese culture signified dishonor and mourning. Their names were replaced with numbers or generic titles like Spring Harmony or Peaceful Virtue. They were forbidden to speak of their families, their homes, their previous lives. Mentioning a mother or father resulted in immediate physical punishment. Every personal possession from their former lives was confiscated and burned. Clothing, jewelry, letters, small tokens, anything that connected them to who they had been. The message was clear: that person no longer existed. They slept in barracks, 20 to a room, on hard wooden platforms. They were woken before dawn and went to sleep after midnight. For months, they existed in a state of exhaustion so complete that resistance became physically impossible. Sleep deprivation is one of the most effective tools of psychological control ever developed, and the palace system used it expertly. When you're exhausted enough, you stop thinking. You stop planning. You stop hoping. You just obey, because obedience is the path of least resistance. The second phase was submission training. The women learned dozens of different ways to bow. Different bows for different ranks of officials. Different depths of bow for different contexts. Different hand positions, different angles of the head, different lengths of time to hold the position. They practiced 8 hours a day. If a bow was imperfectly executed, if the angle was wrong by a few degrees, if they held it for the wrong duration, they were beaten with bamboo rods on their legs and backs. Many carried those scars until death. Archaeological examination of remains from imperial tombs has found skeletal evidence of repeated trauma to leg bones consistent with severe beatings during youth. They learned to walk without making sound, to keep their gaze lowered at all times, to respond to commands without being directly addressed, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to exist without taking up space, without drawing attention, without asserting any form of individual presence. One training manual from the Qing dynasty lists 47 separate rules for how to stand in the emperor's presence. Not how to behave, just how to stand. 47 different specifications for the angle of your feet, the position of your hands, the direction of your gaze, the tension in your shoulders. Violation of any rule meant punishment. And since the rules were often contradictory or impossible to all follow simultaneously, violation was inevitable. This wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the point. The goal was to create a state of perpetual anxiety where perfection was impossible and punishment was always deserved. The third phase involved preparation for their role in the palace. Palace records describe systematic processes designed to eliminate any resistance. Medical examinations became routine. Physical and psychological preparations were documented with clinical detachment in official reports. After months of this process, the women who survived were considered ready to enter the official harem system, ready to begin what palace propaganda called their honored service, ready for a life that, for most of them, would be worse than anything they had already endured. The hierarchy of suffering. The imperial harem wasn't a single, unified space. There was a complex hierarchy where your rank determined literally everything about your existence. At the top stood the empress, the emperor's only official wife. Her position was secure, her status unquestionable. She had her own palace, dozens of servants, enormous food allowances, and political influence that could shape the empire. Below her were the imperial consorts, typically 4 women who held official titles and significant rank. They had their own quarters, their own servants, their own allowances. They could own property, influence appointments, and advocate for their families. Then came the rank concubines, divided into multiple levels, high, middle, and low ranks, each with different privileges. The distinctions might seem minor, but they meant the difference between comfort and suffering. A high-ranking concubine might have a small personal apartment, 2 or 3 servants, and enough food to stay healthy. A low-ranking concubine might share a room with 10 others, have no personal servants, and receive food rations that kept her perpetually hungry. And at the bottom were the unranked women, girls whose status hadn't been determined yet, women who had fallen from favor, servants who existed in a gray zone between concubine and slave. Your rank determined the color of clothes you could wear, the fabric quality, the type of jewelry, the size of your living space, the number of servants, the type of dishes your food was served on, whether you received medical care when sick, whether you froze in winter or had adequate heating. The empress received more than 22 pounds of prime meat every day, along with fresh vegetables, fruits, delicacies from across the empire. She had doctors on call, heated quarters, silk bedding. A low-ranking concubine received barely 4 pounds of food daily, and often less than that because corrupt eunuchs stole provisions before they reached the kitchens. The food was often spoiled or of poor quality. Medical care was essentially non-existent unless a condition was contagious and threatened to spread. The result was predictable malnutrition, disease, premature aging. Women in their 20s looked 40. Their teeth fell out, their hair thinned, their skin developed sores from vitamin deficiencies. And here's the cruelest irony. Their declining appearance made them even less likely to be noticed by the emperor, which meant they stayed in their low rank, which meant their health continued to deteriorate. It was a downward spiral built into the system's design. The hierarchy created another problem. It turned the women against each other. When there are hundreds of people competing for limited resources and one person's gain is necessarily another person's loss, cooperation becomes impossible. Every woman who rose in rank did so by displacing someone else. Every favor granted to one was a favor denied to another. The system was designed to prevent solidarity, to make sure that the women saw each other as enemies rather than fellow victims. And it worked. The selection process. The emperor didn't visit his concubines randomly. They were summoned through an official selection process, and this ritual revealed everything about how the system viewed these women. Every night, a chief eunuch presented the emperor with wooden tablets. Each tablet bore a name and a small portrait of an available woman. Available meaning not menstruating, not sick, not currently in disgrace, and of sufficient rank to be considered. The emperor pointed to a tablet. Sometimes he chose based on the portrait, sometimes based on recommendations from other eunuchs, sometimes randomly because he was bored and didn't particularly care. Once chosen, the woman was taken to the bathing palace, where female attendants prepared her according to strict protocols. The preparation process was designed around one principle: security. The paranoia about potential harm to the emperor was constant, so elaborate precautions were standard. Palace records describe the summoning process in clinical detail, documenting every step to ensure there was official record of each encounter. This documentation served multiple purposes within the imperial bureaucratic system. For most women, being summoned was rare. Many experienced it only once or twice in their entire lives, if at all. The mathematics of waiting. Here's the reality of the numbers. During the Ming Dynasty, there were typically between 500 and 1,000 women in the imperial harem at any given time, sometimes more. The emperor might summon one woman per night, sometimes two, sometimes none, for weeks. Let's be generous and say an emperor summoned a different woman every single night for 40 years. That's roughly 14,600 encounters across 4 decades. But there were thousands of women who cycled through the system during those same 40 years. New girls arrived every 3 years. Old women died. The population constantly turned over. Do the math. The majority of concubines were never summoned. Not once. Not ever. They spent their entire lives, decades potentially, waiting for a call that would never come. Aging in silence. Watching younger girls arrive, knowing that their only purpose, the only reason they were taken from their families, would never be fulfilled. And yet, they couldn't leave. Marriage was forbidden. Children were impossible except through the emperor. They had no legal existence outside the palace. No property, no rights, no autonomy. They were property in permanent storage. Imagine that existence. You're 15 years old when you're taken. You're told your life's purpose is to serve the emperor. You go through months of brutal training. You enter the harem. You wait. Years pass. You're 20, 25, 30. You've never been summoned. Younger girls arrive and you watch them be chosen while you remain invisible. You age out of the preferences. By 30, you're considered old. By 35, you're essentially disqualified from selection. But you still can't leave. You spend the next 20, 30, 40 years living in the palace, serving no function, fulfilling no purpose, simply existing as forgotten property. And some women went decades without speaking to anyone except their roommates, without going outside the palace walls, without seeing family, without experiencing anything that made them feel like human beings rather than abandoned objects. The psychological toll was catastrophic. Depression was universal. Many women developed what we would now recognize as severe mental illness, hallucinations, delusions, catatonic states. Palace records mention women who stopped speaking entirely. Others who developed obsessive behaviors, repeating the same action thousands of times. Others who became violent, attacking fellow concubines or servants. The palace response to mental illness was simple: isolation. Problematic women were moved to remote buildings and essentially abandoned. They received minimal food, no medical care, and no human contact except when someone delivered food. Many women in this state simply stopped eating. The palace recorded their deaths as natural causes and buried them in unmarked graves in the palace cemetery.
The hidden more.
With nothing to do but wait, with no hope of escape, with their entire existence dependent on the arbitrary favor of one man they rarely saw, the women turned on each other. The imperial harem wasn't just a prison. It was an arena where hundreds of women fought an invisible war, every day, for decades. The goal was simple: eliminate your competition, make other women less attractive to the emperor, destroy their chances before they destroyed yours. The methods were sophisticated, ruthless, and often untraceable. Poison was common, not the dramatic kind from movies where someone clutches their throat and collapses. Slow poisons, substances that caused chronic illness, made hair fall out, ruined skin, created digestive problems that led to malnutrition. A woman who was constantly sick, whose beauty was fading, who looked tired and unwell, that woman wouldn't be chosen. And if the illness couldn't be traced to a specific cause, there was no one to blame. Palace records document dozens of cases where women developed mysterious ailments that physicians couldn't explain. Modern analysis of these descriptions suggests arsenic poisoning, mercury exposure, and other forms of deliberate contamination. Concubines bribed eunuchs to remove rivals from the selection tablets. A eunuch might report that a woman was menstruating or sick or in mourning or ritually impure. These reports determined who appeared on the nightly selection, and therefore who had any chance of being chosen. A woman locked out of selection for months would fall in rank, receive fewer resources, become weaker, more desperate, all because a bribed eunuch told a simple lie. Rumors were another weapon. Whisper campaigns could destroy a woman's reputation. Allegations of disloyalty, of improper conduct, of harboring seditious thoughts. None of it needed to be true. Once the rumor spread, once it reached the wrong ears, the damage was done. A woman accused of disloyalty might be interrogated, tortured, demoted, or executed, depending on the political climate and the emperor's mood. And the source of the rumor remained safely anonymous. The most ruthless tactic targeted pregnant women. If a low-ranking concubine became pregnant, she became a threat to every other woman in the harem. A successful pregnancy could vault her to high rank, displacing others, changing power dynamics, threatening established alliances. So pregnancies were often sabotaged. Historical records document cases of women slipping substances into pregnant rivals' food and drink, herbs that caused miscarriages, substances that triggered premature labor, methods that ended pregnancies while leaving the mother alive to be blamed. If a woman lost a pregnancy, she was often accused of negligence or worse. She might be demoted, exiled to remote buildings, or executed, depending on how valuable she was. Empress Wu Zetian, one of the only women to ever rule China in her own name, allegedly caused harm to her own newborn daughter and blamed a rival concubine. The rival was executed. Wu rose to become empress. Historians dispute this account, but the fact that it was believable, that it fit the pattern of behavior everyone expected, tells you everything about the culture of the harem. The violence wasn't always physical. Psychological warfare was constant. Senior concubines tormented junior ones. Favorites isolated potential rivals. Women formed alliances that shattered overnight, based on perceived slights or changing circumstances. One account from the Qing dynasty describes a woman who spent 3 years building a friendship with a rival. 3 years of shared meals, exchanged confidences, mutual support. And then, when the empress launched an investigation into alleged disloyalty, this woman testified against her friend. The testimony was devastating, detailed, impossible to refute. The friend was demoted to servant status. Her children were taken away and raised by other women. She spent her remaining decades cleaning floors in the same palace where she had once held rank. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was survival strategy in an impossible situation. In a system where women had no power except through the emperor's favor, and where that favor was arbitrary and unpredictable, destroying your competition was rational behavior. The tragedy is that the system turned victims into perpetrators. Women who had been kidnapped, brutalized, and dehumanized learned to do the same to others because the alternative was being destroyed first. They weren't monsters. They were people trapped in a monstrous system, doing what they had to do to survive.
The nightmare of motherhood, you. The nightmare of motherhood.
Common logic says that becoming pregnant with the emperor's child would be a concubine's greatest achievement. Elevation in rank, security, purpose, a connection to the emperor that couldn't be severed. Reality was crueler. For a low-ranking concubine, pregnancy was often the worst thing that could happen. High-ranking families didn't want their daughters subjected to this fate. They had enough political power to make their objections heard. The practice was ended, and the emperors pretended it had never existed. But for the women who died before 164, there was no reprieve. To bend us back, the Palace of Perpetual Solitude. The abolition of accompanying sacrifice didn't bring freedom to surviving concubines.
It brought something almost worse. Decades of confinement with no purpose.
When an emperor died, his concubines, who weren't selected for sacrifice, were sent to the Palace of Perpetual Solitude, a section of the Forbidden City reserved for imperial widows. The name tells you everything. The rules were simple and absolute. Never leave the complex. Never marry. Never have contact with the outside world. Perform manual labor. Pray for the dead emperor 3 times daily. 4 decades. These women lived in collective dormitories, sleeping on mats on the floor. They received basic food rations, enough to survive but nothing more. Medical care was provided only if an illness threatened to spread to other parts of the palace. They spent their days in prayer and manual labor, weaving, sewing, cleaning, maintaining the palace buildings, work that had no meaning except to fill the hours. Many experienced severe psychological decline. Without purpose, without hope, without any prospect of change, their mental health deteriorated. Some developed elaborate delusions. Others became catatonic, staring at walls for hours. Others turned violent, attacking anyone who came near. The palace response was the same as always. Isolation. Lock them in a room, provide minimal food, wait. The palace gardens had dozens of ornamental wells. During the 18th century, bodies were found in those wells with disturbing regularity. Matsikis, as though the tour elaptigruth, marked in so marts, could say, indenibly, is the ontwant in the brung to acceptable, you accept less. An example in the old Chaffenwall, so it's name. Oops. The dominable people have something they could just get to it. The youngest recorded widow was 14 years old. She had been married to an elderly emperor for 3 months before he died. She spent the next 61 years in the Palace of Perpetual Solitude. She was 75 when she finally died, having spent her entire adult life mourning a man she barely knew, whose face she probably couldn't remember. 6 decades of waiting to die, 6 decades of prayers, 6 decades of emptiness. That was the mercy the system offered to women who survived. The last concubine. The concubine system officially ended in 1912 with the fall of the Qing dynasty, but the last imperial concubine didn't die until 1946. Her name was Wan Rong, and she was the last empress of China. She married Puyi, the last emperor, when she was 17. Puyi was already a puppet ruler, a figurehead emperor, presiding over the collapse of a dynasty. But Wan Rong believed in the romance, the tradition, the honor. She learned the truth quickly. After the 1912 revolution, the imperial family was allowed to remain in the Forbidden City, but stripped of real power. Wan Rong lived in golden cages, surrounded by luxury, but utterly powerless. When the Japanese invaded Manchuria, they installed Puyi as puppet emperor of Manchukuo. Wan Rong was forced along, made to play empress of a fabricated state. She suffered abuse from Japanese officers. She became pregnant. When Puyi discovered the pregnancy, he was furious, accusing her of bringing disgrace to the imperial line. The baby, a daughter, died shortly after birth, under circumstances that were never fully explained. Wan Rong never fully recovered from the trauma. She turned to opium. The addiction consumed her. By the time the Japanese puppet state collapsed in 1945, she was broken physically and mentally. The Chinese communists captured her and imprisoned her as a symbol of the old regime. She spent her final months in detention, suffering from addiction, having lost all her children, despised by both the regime she represented and the one that replaced it.
She died in 1946 at 39 years old. Her body was buried in an unmarked grave.
The last empress of China. Discarded, forgotten, erased. What the walls remember. Today, 14 million tourists visit the Forbidden City every year. They walk through golden courtyards. They admire yellow-tiled roofs. They photograph the throne rooms and ceremonial halls. They buy souvenirs from shops selling imperial merchandise. Tour guides speak of magnificent architecture and imperial power. They describe the sophistication of palace life, the refinement of court culture, the glory of Chinese civilization. They don't mention the Palace of Perpetual Solitude. They don't point out the wells where bodies were found. They don't explain why certain buildings in the palace complex were closed for decades and used as storage rooms. The Palace of Compassion and Tranquility, where hundreds of women died, developed a reputation that made palace officials uncomfortable. They spent years trying to suppress the stories, not by addressing the history, but by denying it existed. Some walls still bear marks, evidence that, if you know what you're looking for, suggests the suffering that occurred there. But tourists don't see these things, because tour guides don't show them. Modern China prefers to celebrate its history without examining the human cost. The Forbidden City is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a symbol of cultural achievement, a source of national pride. And it is all of those things. The architecture is magnificent. The artistry is extraordinary. The cultural significance is undeniable. But it's also a tomb. More than 100,000 women passed through the concubine system over 2,000 years of imperial rule. Most of their names were never recorded. Most of their stories were never told. They existed as numbers in ledgers, as bodies in tombs, as ghosts in palaces that tourists now photograph for social media. Historians estimate that fewer than 10% of these women are documented in any meaningful way. The vast majority simply disappeared into the system, lived their lives in silence, and died without leaving any trace. We know they existed because of administrative records, requisition orders for clothing, food allocation tables, building maintenance logs that mention occupancy numbers. They're documented the same way inventory is documented, because that's what they were. A pregnant concubine was immediately isolated in the most remote palaces of the Forbidden City. She was cut off from all her previous social connections, all her alliances, everything she had built. She spent 9 months under constant surveillance. Eunuchs watched her every moment. Everything she ate was recorded and approved. Every person who approached her was documented. She couldn't receive visitors, send messages, or communicate with anyone outside her designated area. This was framed as protection, ensuring the safety of the imperial heir. In reality, it was imprisonment. When the baby was born, it was immediately taken away. If it was a boy, he was handed to wet nurses and raised in a separate building far from his biological mother. The mother might see him once or twice a year, always supervised by eunuchs without permission to hold him or spend time with him. Her son would grow up not knowing her face, not recognizing her voice. Raised to see the empress or a high-ranking consort as his mother figure, while his actual mother remained a stranger. If the baby was a girl, the outcome was often worse. Imperial daughters of low-ranking mothers had almost no political value. They couldn't inherit, they couldn't rule. They were useful only as diplomatic tools, married off to foreign princes or local nobles to cement alliances. Many simply disappeared. Palace records didn't bother documenting the fate of daughters born to low-ranking concubines. No birth records, no death records, no documentation at all. There are accounts of women so desperate to avoid bringing a daughter into the system that they sought ways to prevent pregnancy entirely, despite the risks to themselves. And if a child died, regardless of gender, the mother was usually blamed. Children in the palace died frequently: measles, smallpox, dysentery, pneumonia. The palace was crowded. Sanitation was poor despite the luxury, and medical understanding was limited. Child mortality was high. But when an imperial child died, someone had to be held responsible. The mother was accused of negligence, of failing to protect the child, of having bad karma or spiritual pollution that caused the death, sometimes of intentional harm, even when the death was clearly from natural illness. One concubine during the Qing dynasty lost 3 sons to smallpox. 3 children, all dead before age 5, all from a disease that affected thousands of children across China every year. She was accused of having poisoned karma. Imperial diviners declared that her spiritual essence was toxic to imperial bloodlines. She was confined to a single room in a remote building and forbidden from seeing any member of the imperial family ever again. She spent the next 40 years in that room, alone, no visitors, no companionship, nothing but her memories of 3 dead sons and the knowledge that she was blamed for their deaths. Her crime was being their mother. Her punishment was dying alone. This is what motherhood meant in the imperial harem. Not fulfillment, not purpose, not elevation, just another form of suffering, another way the system found to break these women. The Night of Blood. As brutal as daily life in the harem was, nothing prepared anyone for what happened in 1421. Emperor Yongle had just completed the Forbidden City. It was the peak of his power, the pinnacle of his reign, the largest palace complex ever built, the center of the most powerful empire on earth. And then a rumor destroyed thousands of lives. One of the emperor's favorite concubines was found deceased. The official announcement declared poison. Someone had caused her death, and an investigation would find the culprit. But unofficial rumors told a different story, one that implicated palace politics and questioned the emperor's authority in deeply personal ways. Whether any of this was true is unknowable. What matters is that Yongle believed the rumors were spreading, and he couldn't tolerate them. His reaction was extreme. Humiliated, paranoid, consumed by rage, he ordered an investigation. But he wasn't seeking justice. He was seeking to silence everyone who might know the rumor. In a single night, totaling 800 women lost their lives. Not just concubines, servants, cooks, laundresses, seamstresses, attendants, any woman who lived in the palace, who might have heard something, who might have talked to someone, who might possibly know anything about the rumor. The methods used were brutal and designed to instill terror throughout the palace. The process continued through the night. Girls as young as 12 were included, women who had served the palace for decades, pregnant concubines, elderly servants who had been there since the previous emperor's reign. It didn't matter. Anyone who might have known, anyone who might have talked, anyone who existed in the wrong place at the wrong time. By dawn, the courtyards required extensive cleaning. The same courtyards where, in later years, so many women would meet tragic ends. There is no official record of this event in Ming imperial documents. The court erased it from history, struck it from the archives, forbade anyone from mentioning it under penalty of death. But one testimony survived. Lady Kui was a Korean concubine who happened to be outside the palace that night, visiting a sick relative under special dispensation. She escaped the purge by accident, by pure luck of being somewhere else when it started. Years later, she dictated her account to a Korean diplomatic envoy who was visiting the palace. She described what she witnessed when she returned, the aftermath that lasted until dawn, the evidence she saw throughout the palace complex. She named women she had known, girls she had trained alongside, friends who had shared her meals, people who had been alive when she left that evening and were gone by the time she returned. Her testimony was preserved in Korean diplomatic archives, where Ming censors couldn't reach it, couldn't destroy it, couldn't erase it from history. It remains one of the only first-hand accounts of what happened that night. Lady Kui herself didn't escape for long. When Emperor Yongle died 3 years later, she was among the women selected for eternal honor. Her last recorded words, preserved by the same Korean envoy, "I survived the night of blood, only to die in silk." The final service. Surviving the emperor's life was no guarantee of freedom. For many women, his death meant their own. During the Ming Dynasty, there was a practice called sunzang, accompanying sacrifice. When an emperor died, his favorite concubines were buried with him. The logic was simple. The emperor would need company in the afterlife. Who better than the women who had served him in life? 3 days after an emperor's death, eunuchs compiled a list of selected women, between 5 and 30 names, depending on the emperor's wishes and political circumstances. The chosen ones received a final meal, delicacies they'd never tasted, wine they had been forbidden to drink, the finest food the imperial kitchens could produce. Some accounts describe musicians playing while the women ate, as if it were a celebration, as if they should be grateful for this honor. Then came the choice: accept their fate voluntarily or face forced compliance. Those who accepted were given white silk cords. This was considered the honorable path. The woman's family received economic compensation and official recognition of their daughter's sacrifice. Some families encouraged their daughters to accept willingly, but not every woman went willingly. Those who refused, who fought, who begged for their lives, faced forced compliance. Sometimes they were given substances that rendered them unconscious. Their bodies were placed in seated positions in chambers surrounding the main tomb, arranged as if they were waiting, attending, serving even in death. In 1958, Chinese archaeologists opened the tomb of Emperor Jingtai from the Ming Dynasty. They found remains of 16 women inside chambers. All were seated. All showed evidence consistent with the historical records, but 3 skeletons showed evidence of struggle, fractured bones in the arms and hands, marks on the stone walls, deep gouges in the stone where fingernails had scraped, suggesting they had tried to escape. This practice continued for over a century. It was finally abolished in 1464, not out of compassion or moral progress, but because the families of victims were becoming politically problematic. The Forbidden City covers 180 acres. It contains 980 buildings. Its walls are 26 feet high and 3,000 feet long. More than 100,000 women lived and died behind those walls over 2,000 years. That's 0.80 acres per woman. That's 9.8 buildings per 1,000 women. That's 30 feet of wall per life. These numbers are absurd because they're trying to quantify something unquantifiable. You can't measure suffering in square footage. You can't divide tragedy by architecture. But the Forbidden City invites measurement. Its scale is part of its grandeur. Its size demonstrates power. So let's measure differently. If each woman who died there was mourned for 1 minute, that mourning would last 69 days and nights without stopping. If each woman's name was spoken aloud, it would take more than 16 hours of continuous reading. If each woman got a single page to tell her story, it would fill a library larger than any that existed during the empire. These women didn't get minutes or pages. Most didn't even get names that survived, that they got forgotten. And the city that erased them is now celebrated as the pinnacle of Chinese cultural achievement.
Words.
The girl at the beginning of the story was real. Her name in Korean records was Consort Han. She was 16 when they took her, 32 when she died. 16 years she spent inside those walls. 16 years of training, waiting, serving, suffering. 16 years of asking to see her mother. 16 years of being told no. When she died, her body was placed in a tomb next to the emperor who owned her. Her mother, unable to write, never knew where her daughter was buried. Han was one of tens of thousands. Her story survived only because Korean diplomatic records documented the tribute women. Most women didn't even get that. They vanished into the red walls and never came out. The Forbidden City still stands because stone endures, but stone is silent. The stories survive only when people choose to tell them. So now you know. Now you've heard what the tour guides won't say. Now you understand what the photographs don't show. The walls remember, the stones remember, and now you remember too. What you do with that memory is up to you, but you can't unhear this. You can't unsee it. The next time you see images of the Forbidden City, the next time someone talks about Imperial China's glory, you'll know the cost. 100,000 lives, 2,000 years, zero justice. The empire is gone. The system is ended. But the victims deserve to be more than forgotten numbers. They deserve to be remembered as what they were: human beings who suffered, who endured, who died, and whose stories were deliberately erased. This is their story, incomplete, inadequate, unable to capture the full horror of what they experienced. But told. Finally told. The silence is broken. The walls have spoken, and the dead have been named, if only for a moment, if only in these words. They were here, they mattered, and they should never be forgotten again.